And for a period of time, there was a thought that, the supply fundamentals were such that there was going to be more supply than demand. But I don't think that's really the case. I think projects are going to take longer to get built. And I think what's starting to happen is you're starting to see that people are coming back into this, and there's going to be a scarcity of quality projects out there.
Today's guest is a supporting sponsor of Liberty in Finance.
Welcome back to Liberty in Finance. We're glad to have this returning guest. Tony Giardini is the president and CEO of Trilogy Metals. He joins us again this Friday, November 4th, 2022. Tony, thanks for coming back on Liberty in Finance.
Well, thanks for having me, and what a great day for copper investors. We're seeing copper up 24 cents. It's a pretty good day to the end of a week for the investors in base metals.
It's actually been a rather eventful week in precious metals as well. There was a bit of a dip yesterday that got some people's attention, and now today metals have opened up broadly higher. So it's a time of expected movement, and a lot of things are happening geopolitically and elsewhere in the world that have people keeping their eyes on precious metals in general. In fact, before we get into some very specific questions about related to Trilogy and some viewers' questions that have been submitted, I wondered if we could field one question that has come up the last time we spoke together with Rick Rule, you and I, and that was this, what he calls kind of the early middle innings of a secular bull market in both commodities and metals, and wondering if you're seeing any update for our viewers on where you see us standing in that broad picture of the overall metals market. Do you still believe that we are in the, as Rick called it, the early to middle innings of a multi-year bull market in commodities and precious metals?
I think people are starting to get very excited about the opportunities, particularly on the base side. And, there's been a lot of talk about critical metals and how copper is going to be needed as we look at electrification of a grid, electric vehicles, and all of those things. And for a period of time, there was a thought that, the supply fundamentals were such that there was going to be more supply than demand. But I don't think that's really the case. I think projects are going to take longer to get built. And I think what's starting to happen is you're starting to see that people are coming back into this, and there's going to be a scarcity of quality projects out there. So I think it's really the case. And the other thing that I would encourage your listeners, viewers to do is just look at how copper has performed this year and where the equities are. And, earlier this year, copper was almost at $5 US. It's now around $3.65, $3.66 today. But the equities are starting to pick up. And in fact, I would say the equities have outperformed the copper price up until now. And I think that's a very broad indication that we're going to see continued interest in copper in the metal side, especially as China starts to move away from some of the strict COVID protocols that they've had in place. So I'm very bullish when it comes to copper. And I think when we talk about our story, it's really about the opportunity to bring on a tier one copper asset into development in the future.
We're doing this interview in early November, which obviously we're well into fall. It's the end of the summer season, which in Alaska and other northern provinces, Canada and so on, often is the opportunity time for people to do exploration, drilling, etc. So you've just wrapped up or are wrapping up a summer season of field work, and I wonder if you could bring us to an update on what you've learned in this past season.
Yeah, so what we had originally planned for this year was we had about a 10,000 meter drill campaign. In fact, we had actually started at about 7,500 meters in terms of a planned campaign. Then we brought it up to 10,100. We ultimately drilled 10,738 meters, and it was centered on three areas. One, Arctic being the primary area, where we drilled about 8,400 meters, and an area called the Ambler Belt, and then Cosmos Hills. We've also done an extraordinary amount of soil samples, where we took approximately 4,000 samples from 4,300 different locations that we looked at, with a lot of that being focused on the Ambler Belt. So we're very happy with the performance in terms of the exploration performance over the course of the last 4 months. And what happens now is we're waiting for the drill results to come in, and they should start to come in fairly shortly. So we'll be providing the market with updates on our drilling as far as the current field season goes.
We had heard from several companies in the past, especially during the COVID years, that drill results were extremely backlogged because the workload on the laboratories and their ability to move things through was severely constrained. Are you seeing a return to normal turnarounds? Are you expecting earlier results, or will it be a patience game here waiting for those results to come in?
That's a great question. And I would say it'll be better than last year, but we're not quite back to where we were previously. Whereas we could have hoped to have had a lot of the drill results before, let's say, the end of November. We're going to get some drill results before the end of November, but we won't have the bulk of them until later this year. So we're definitely seeing improvement. But then again, what I would say is that there's just a backlog in the sense that particularly with COVID a couple of years ago when people didn't drill and people are wanting to get out there and drill. And so I think the labs are still inundated, but we're definitely going to see better turnaround times this year than we had last year.
You mentioned along the way the Ambler District, and we have a specific viewer's question I'd like to see if you could give us an answer on. Joseph S. asks, what's going on with the Ambler Road? Is government going to get out of the way?
Yeah, the biggest impact on our share price has been the uncertainty with respect to the road. And just for everyone that, I know that some people know the story well, so I'll give a bit of a quick overview of where we're at. In 2020, we were there was a joint record of decision called the JROD, which was issued by the Bureau of Land Management and Army Corps of Engineers. Shortly after that, there were lawsuits that were brought on by NGOs that were against any development of a road. And that process sort of continued. Obviously, we had a change in administration in January 2021. And what ultimately happened was that the Department of Interior filed a motion to remand this record of decision on the EIS to complete supplemental work where they felt that there were deficiencies related to cultural heritage and subsistence matters. So that occurred in February of this year, and that's when we really started to see a sell-off in the stock where people were just wondering what the hell's going on. So what's happened since then is that the BLM has published the notice of intent to initiate a scoping study, which is tied to supplemental EIS, and they expect to have the draft EIS completed by the second half of next year. So in answer to the question, is government getting out of the way? I think we're seeing some progress. We're happy that they're targeting the middle of next year to sort of complete the work. The thing that does concern us, though, is we don't have a real timeline as to when the remand will be lifted and the JROB will be put back in place. And just for everyone that's sort of following permitting in the U.S., the JROB process was roughly a 5-year process. So we felt that there was already an extremely robust process. So we're a little disappointed that we're in the situation that we're in. And then the other thing that I would just highlight is that we have tremendous support from a congressional delegation in the state of Alaska. I would point out that Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan have been very supportive, and they've, highlighted to the Department of Interior and the Biden administration that the congressional mandates that exist in ANILCA really tie into President Biden's goals for the development of a domestic supply of critical and strategic metals. So they're encouraging them to get on with it. What's really interesting, though, is that we have a new representative in the state of Alaska, a native Alaskan, Mary Patola, and she's basically written a very strong letter to the Department of Interior, really highlighting that the mineral resources in the area, which include copper, are really critical importance to the country, and really highlighting that this project is very important to Native Alaskans and there's strong support within the tribes for it, and that she would like to see this project move forward, assuming that support is across the board. So it's very good that we're seeing this congressional support. So we're hopeful that, as the question was phrased, the government will get out of the way and we'll be able to sort of move this forward. But unfortunately, there is a process to be completed. So we'll see where things go. But at least we have a timeline for the supplemental EIS.
Now, you mentioned there briefly native tribes that are stakeholders that would be beneficiaries, and there may have been some concern on their behalf as far as let's make sure we do this right in terms of the road and how it might impact subsistence hunting or whatever, that sort of thing. The question from another viewer gets at to this, and I'd like you to see if you could address it. William Mueller says, are mining companies concerned that ESG corporate activism will one day shut them down? You've certainly stressed some of the strengths that Trilogy has in terms of relationship with First Nation stakeholders. Are there both the positive aspects and are there any sort of business unfriendly aspects of ESG that you're encountering as we move into that?
Yeah, so the main issues that were brought up as part of this EIS or supplemental EIS were associated with cultural resources and subsistence, and those are the two focuses of the EIS. How it ties into the broader case of ESG, and particularly in our case, we have strong Native support. NANA, which is a Native corporation, state of Alaska, is our economic partner, so they get to either participate in direct ownership interest of the mines that get developed in the Ambler Mining District, or they can take a net profit interest. And one of the things that we've highlighted in recent discussions with Native communities that would be impacted by the project is just what we're focused on doing in terms of workforce development, scholarships within the communities, and really thinking about the longer term process of how we ensure that there's strong community support and outreach associated with the project. ESG is going to be something that's not going to go away. It's going to be critical to the industry as we go forward. We feel we have a strong ESG story, particularly given our situation in terms of having NANA as an economic partner in the project and working with us side by side and having the strong community support that we have going forward. So as the project continues to move forward, we think those will be the key focus areas for us in terms of ESG. The last thing I'll say just on the whole subject of ESG is that the discussion about critical metals is quite interesting. The U.S. government is really focused on ensuring there's domestic supply of these metals. And I'm not suggesting that there has to be a relaxing of the processes, but there certainly has to be a way so that the permitting and approval process has to be done in a fashion where these projects aren't held up for a longer period of time than they should be. And there's going to be a balance, I think, it's going to be needed here in terms of how the government's looking at the permitting for these projects, not relaxing things, but looking at how we can move these projects forward and thinking about domestic supplies of critical metals. So some of those critical metals that we have in the Ambler District include zinc and cobalt. We don't have copper is not considered a critical metal, but some would argue that it is a critical metal, particularly in terms of domestic supply. So, we'll be interested to see how there's a balancing between the ESG considerations and moving these projects forward, not just our project, but obviously other projects in the United States.
I guess that last theme that you touched on there, it really strikes a nerve for our viewers because there have been so many ideology-driven positions and narratives and policies sort of promulgated by administrations in the last decade or so that seem to be disconnected from the boots on the ground realities of how things actually work. My background is in physics and engineering, so I tend to have a very physical understanding of how things work and processes. So when you set a goal like whatever it is, so many percent of electric vehicles by 2030, or eliminating fossil fuel usage by 2050, or whatever these different goals are, it's if they're not accompanied by the reality of how you get there, how you cross that bridge, which almost always, if not always, relies on very specific materials that need to be available and the ability to apply those into industries and into infrastructure that's going to support some of those desired outcomes, it can be almost just a fantasy world. So where are you seeing signs of concern and maybe signs of hope and promise as far as that reconciling of ideology versus reality so that we can actually move forward in a way that's meaningful and actually has results that are sustainable?
There's a lot to focus on in terms of that particular point, Duncan. I mean, let's use oil and gas as a really good example. And you talked about some of the narratives associated with, deadlines. So California's come out and talked about 2035, no more internal combustion engines basically being sold. Although I think it will depend on the types of vehicles, but that's where the plan is right now. And I think what we're seeing, not just in the U.S. but around the world, is inflationary impacts associated with oil and gas. And a large part of it is not just about domestic supply, but because as we're coming back through COVID, the demand for oil and gas has become higher and higher. And there hasn't been a lot of work that's been done in the last several years because of the narrative associated with fossil fuels. And so these products are becoming scarcer in some sense, and there's less exploration going on. And you can see that same narrative play out in the base metal side. And that's the path that we're going to go down. Everyone's looking at 366 copper today, and they're going to think, well, that's gone up a lot. But I don't think it's gone up a lot when you start to think about how all of these pieces play themselves out. And the thing that worries me is when you start to put these deadlines in place and people are trying to move to them, it's not clear that we're going to get there. And so when we talk about inflation, we're all feeling the impacts. I can tell you that, how much of core inflation is, we can pull that out, but then it gets into the food chain simply because we see the vehicles that are needed to transport the goods that are having to pay more and so on and so forth. What's interesting up in Alaska, when I talk about these native communities that are supportive of our project, just to give your viewers and listeners a bit of context, they're looking at about $17 a gallon in terms of their fuel costs for heating and for fuel in those communities. And a big part of that is just the remote location of where they're in. So they have to be barged in, and they have to be taken on snowmobiles and brought into these very remote communities. And one of the big benefits that we see from the road and the potential for that road is that it could help bring the cost of living down in these communities where right now people are really strapped. And I know when we talk about $5 a gallon in terms of gas, that seems like a big number. So think about it in the context of $17 a gallon in these remote communities. So the communities are concerned about the scarcity of the supply and they're feeling it. And so when it ties into our narrative about the project and this road, it's also going to be how the communities are going to benefit from a road going forward. But I think what you highlighted with respect to the specific dates that are put out there, no one really knows how long it's going to take for us to build out the infrastructure for electric vehicles. And we also, there are some great stories. There was a story about a month ago where I think in California, on the Labor Day long weekend, they asked people to not charge their vehicles during certain hours because they were concerned about the impact on the grid and brownouts. So here we're moving to more electric powered vehicles, but we're concerned about the ability to actually supply the electricity to the grid that's necessary. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting challenges as we move forward. And I can tell you that supply of base metals, copper in particular, is going to be a big one as we go down the road.
It reminds me of other ambitious goals that have been set by government and achieved, like putting a man on the moon, for example. That was a point of amazement to many in the world when it was able to be accomplished. But that was putting, one vehicle and one very small crew in a very difficult place. Here we're trying to move, through some of these policies, trying to move an entire industries, entire infrastructures, entire everything for an entire country and the world. It's much more ambitious. And
there's a lot of competition for these metals and access to these metals. It's not like the U.S. is the only game in town. If you look at, how China has really used has gone into developing countries and work with those developing countries to secure supplies of copper and other metals. And I think, they've been very strategic in those initiatives. And now I think a lot of people are trying to play catch up as we're looking at how we secure these. And especially if we want domestic supply, going to have to be some trade-offs here in terms of how we're going to go about it.
Now, you've mentioned in the past, and I'd like to get an update from you, changes coming in the future. What changes do you see coming for Trilogy and for the industry that you're looking towards in the next few quarters or years?
Yeah, so I think for us, the big thing will be, let's get these drill results out. Let's continue to see how the draft EIS moves forward. Let's see what happens with the tone. We've got an election coming up in the U.S. in less than a week's time, and let's see what happens with the tone if there's a change in the makeup of Congress. And for us, what we really want to do is get back to focusing on moving our project forward and getting certainty with the road, recognizing that even if a remand is lifted, there's still a lawsuit that needs to be completed. But getting that remand lifted and knowing that we've got our JRAW back in place will certainly give us a lot more confidence in terms of moving forward. The other things that we're focused on is the next step in the permitting process associated with the mine. And then we're looking at some potential studies with respect to satellite deposits in and around the Arctic deposit. We should also have an economic update for U.S. reporting purposes called SK 1300, which we'll be filing in the early part of 2023. So those are the focus areas that we have right now.
Well, we would be delighted if you'd return and update our viewers and prospective investors as we're interested in the natural resources space. We're very interested in critical materials such as copper, cobalt, etc. As you get those results in, so looking for your return back here to give us updates as you have them, as they come in, and always grateful for your presence here with us on Liberty and Finance.
Well, and I appreciate the opportunity to come back on. And, lastly, just closing, if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me directly through Trilogy. Happy to give a bit more color on what's going on at Trilogy. As I said, today's a big day for copper. It's looking like the market's starting to move in the right direction again, which is very positive.
So, folks, please look in the description of this video. We'll put contact information for Tony and for Trilogy so that you can find out all that you want to about their company, what they're up into, and where they're headed, and something to keep your eyes on. It's one of the companies that has received the endorsement and attention of Rick Rule, who we have on frequently on our channel. Tony, on behalf of all of our viewers, thanks for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
I appreciate it. And again, thanks again.